Mr. Arthur Harrison, his gaze as sharp and unyielding as the neatly stacked textbooks on his desk, confiscated a worn poetry book from Chloe. As his firm hand closed around the slender volume, a dried, fragile wildflower brushed against his thumb, sending a jolt through him. "Mr. Harrison, please, I need that back," Chloe said, her voice a low murmur that barely cut through the scraping of chairs as other students filed out. Her backpack, patched and faded, was slung over one shoulder. Mr. Harrison didn't look up from the book, its cover soft with age. "Class time is for learning, Miss Vance, not for personal reading. You may retrieve it after school." Chloe's jaw tightened. She hesitated, a silent protest in her posture, then turned, casting a lingering, almost protective glance at the book before disappearing through the door. The classroom emptied, the last echoes of teenage chatter fading, leaving Arthur Harrison in a silence as profound as the regret he carried. He picked up the offending poetry book, intending to place it on the confiscated shelf, a purgatory for forgotten distractions. But as his fingers traced the worn spine, a delicate pressed wildflower, its petals a faded violet, fluttered from between the pages. It landed on his polished oak desk, a tiny, fragile whisper from another time. His breath hitched. He knew that flower. The staunch Viola arvensis, a rare field pansy, almost impossible to find in this urban sprawl. A species so distinct, so particular to a handful of forgotten meadows. A jolt, sharp and visceral, shot through him, instantly shattering the carefully constructed composure he had maintained for decades. The scent of sun-baked earth and sweet clover filled his mind, transporting him to a sun-drenched meadow 30 years ago. Young Arthur, all lean angles and nervous energy, knelt, carefully plucking a Viola arvensis. He presented it, still dewy, to Eleanor Vance, her smile radiant, her eyes reflecting the endless summer sky. "It's a secret flower," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a love that felt both boundless and doomed. "Just for us." Eleanor, her fingers brushing his, had laughed, a sound like wind chimes. A secret, then. She'd pressed the fragile bloom between the pages of a slim volume of poetry, a collection of verses by Emily Dickinson, their clandestine language. "To remember," she'd said, her gaze locking with his, a silent promise in her eyes that even then he knew they might never keep. The memory, as vivid as a wound freshly opened, evaporated, leaving Arthur Harrison clutching the forgotten poetry book, the withered wildflower, a stark reality on his desk. It couldn't be. Just a coincidence, a trick of a tired mind, yearning for a past long dead. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he tried to slip the delicate flower back into the book. Millions of poetry books, thousands of wildflowers. This particular species, yes, was rare but not unique. He repeated the rationalizations like a mantra, a desperate attempt to push back the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Yet, a profound sense of unease, cold and undeniable, settled deep in his gut. The past, he realized, was not content to remain buried. Mr. Arthur Harrison returned to his quiet, meticulously ordered apartment, the poetry book clutched in his hand like a forbidden artifact. He didn't drop it onto the hall table, didn't toss it onto a chair. Instead, he carried it with a strange reverence, placing it carefully on his bedside table, its worn cover a dark smudge against the pristine white linen. He avoided opening it, avoided even looking directly at the fragile wildflower he knew lay pressed within its pages. His usual evening ritual, a precise cup of tea, a well-worn classic novel, felt absurdly trivial. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and routine, was a restless sea, churning with questions he dared not voice, memories he thought long buried. The book sat there, a silent, unsettling presence, a tiny, unassuming wedge driven into the carefully constructed composure of his solitary life. The book's presence conjured a storm. 30 years ago, the rain had streamed down the smudged window of the dim cafe, mirroring the tears on Eleanor Vance's face. Her beauty, usually so vibrant, was shadowed by despair. "My family, they're sending me away," she choked out, her hand pressed against her stomach. "I'm pregnant, Arthur. With our child." The words had hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, his future. He'd reached for her, a futile, desperate gesture, but her resolve, born of fear and her powerful family's iron will, was unyielding. "They'll disown me. They'll ruin you. They'll make sure the child disappears." He was a penniless artist, a dreamer. She was from old money, a world he couldn't touch. He was powerless. He remembered the helpless despair, the agonizing truth that his love, his promises, were nothing against the crushing weight of her family's influence. He'd watched her walk out into the rain, taking his heart, his future, and the child he never knew, with her. The next morning, the sterile bustle of the high school hallway felt alien, a jarring contrast to the quiet torment of his night. Mr. Harrison spotted Chloe by her locker, her backpack slung low, a slight slump to her shoulders. She wore the same slightly faded jeans, the same quiet defiance in her posture. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. She quickly averted hers, a familiar, almost automatic gesture of teenage rebellion against authority. But today, he saw past the student. He noticed the faint, dark smudges beneath her eyes, the careful neatness of her worn clothes, a quiet resilience that resonated with something deep within him. A flicker ignited in his mind, not a judgment, but a question. A connection tenuous and terrifying began to form, linking her to the ghost that had haunted his sleep. Back in his apartment, the lingering image of Chloe's quiet strength propelled him to a dusty corner of his study. Behind a stack of old textbooks, he found a small, unmarked wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst dried paintbrushes and a half-finished poem, was a faded black-and-white photograph. It was Eleanor, decades younger, her hair unbound, a radiant, unburdened smile gracing her lips. Her eyes, full of a boundless light, stared out at him, piercing the veil of years. He traced her face with a trembling finger. That smile, that vibrant energy, it was the Eleanor he had loved, the one whose memory he had painstakingly buried beneath layers of academic discipline and stoic detachment. A sharp pang of longing and regret, as fresh as if it were yesterday, stirred in his chest. He held the photograph in one hand, the pressed wildflower in the other. He laid them side by side on his desk, the delicate petals of the flower almost indistinguishable from the ghostly white of Eleanor's youthful dress. The sheer, impossible coincidence of it gnawed at him. A rare wildflower, the exact species he'd only ever found in one forgotten meadow, pressed into a poetry book, the very edition he and Eleanor had cherished. To dismiss it now as a trick of the mind, a figment of a lonely man's imagination, felt like a deliberate lie. He couldn't. A cold, hard knot of resolve began to tighten in his gut. He had to understand. He had to know. The past, it seemed, was not content to remain buried. The final bell shrieked, slicing through the quiet hum of the classroom. Students gathered their belongings, their chatter a low tide receding. Mr. Arthur Harrison remained at his desk, sorting papers with a meticulous, almost ritualistic precision. He expected Chloe. Sure enough, a shadow fell across his desk. Chloe stood there, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, her posture defiant but her eyes holding a flicker of vulnerability. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice tight, "my book. I really need it back." He looked up, his gaze steady. He had anticipated this. Her protectiveness, he noted, was fierce, a quiet echo of the young waitress Eleanor had observed. "It has sentimental value," Chloe added, her voice softening, a desperate plea underlying the assertion. Harrison held the worn poetry book, its cover faded, the wildflower still tucked carefully inside, unseen by Chloe. He considered her for a moment, the stern teacher persona a carefully maintained facade. This was his chance, a delicate thread to pull. "I understand, miss," he said, his voice measured. "But school rules are clear. Distractions are disruptive." He paused then, as if an afterthought. "This particular edition, it's quite old. Where did you acquire it?" Chloe hesitated, her eyes darting to the book, then back to his face. It's a family heirloom," she mumbled. A vague, almost evasive answer. Harrison pressed gently, his tone still mild. "A family heirloom. Interesting. Is your family particularly fond of poetry? Or perhaps wildflowers?" Chloe shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The conversation, he knew, was now a game of chess. Over the next few days, Mr. Harrison found himself watching Chloe with a new, almost obsessive intensity. Not the stern, disciplinary gaze of a teacher, but the discerning, analytical eye of an investigator. In the bustling hallway, he observed her quiet, almost solitary movements. In the cafeteria, she ate alone, often with her nose buried in a book, though not the confiscated poetry collection. He noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the slight frown that creased her brow when she concentrated, the subtle resilience etched into her young face. Once he saw her sitting on a bench, idly tracing the cover of a textbook with her finger, a wistful, distant expression on her face. No obvious, concrete connections to Eleanor emerged, no smoking gun. Yet, the coincidence of the wildflower, the book, and this girl refused to be dismissed. His suspicion, once a tiny seed, now took root, growing into a persistent, unsettling concern. After school, instead of his usual route home, Harrison drove to an older part of town, to a narrow, independent bookstore he'd frequented decades ago. The bell above the door jingled, announcing his entrance into a sanctuary of dust and forgotten stories. The owner, a man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, looked up from behind a towering stack of first editions. Harrison described the worn poetry collection, the distinctive cover, the specific poet. The owner's eyes lit up. "Ah, yes," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "A regional printing, quite limited. Circa 30, maybe 35 years ago. Not a bestseller, but cherished. Often found in the collections of local artists, poets, the bohemian crowd. Not many of these left now." Harrison's heart gave a sudden, hard thump against his ribs. Local artists, bohemian crowd. The words echoed, drawing him closer to a past he had tried so desperately to bury. Back in the quiet solitude of his apartment, the bookstore owner's words replayed in Arthur Harrison's mind. Taural, local artists, bohemian crowd. He pulled out his old, clunky laptop, the screen flickering to life. What little he knew of Eleanor's life before her family had swept her away was of her burgeoning artistic talent, her dreams of a studio, of painting the vibrant world she saw. He began to research, typing in keywords, local artists, North Beach, late 80s. Hours blurred. Then, a faded article from an obscure arts newsletter, a brief mention of a promising young painter, Eleanor Vance, whose vibrant florals captured the fleeting beauty of the Bay Area. A reclusive artist, it stated, who disappeared from the scene shortly after. The connection, once a faint whisper, now roared. Eleanor, the wildflower, the book, Chloe. The threads wove together, too strong, too precise to be mere coincidence. A revelation, both terrifying and exhilarating, settled deep in his bones. He knew with a certainty that both thrilled and chilled him that he was on the precipice of uncovering a truth that would shatter his carefully constructed world. The fluorescent hum of the school library usually provided a sterile backdrop for Arthur Harrison's prep period, a quiet sanctuary from the adolescent chaos. Today, however, it was a crucible for his burgeoning obsession. He sat hunched over a heavy botanical text, its pages brittle with age, the smell of old paper and dust filling his nostrils. His finger, usually so precise marking essays, traced the delicate illustration of a specific wildflower, Anemone pulsatilla asterisk, or Pasquet flower. Rare, obscure, but unmistakably, the same species pressed within Chloe's poetry book. The text detailed its specific habitat, disturbed ground, neglected meadows, often found near old industrial or artistic districts, where wild growth reclaimed forgotten spaces. A cold certainty settled in Harrison's gut. The old art district. Eleanor's studio. The pieces clicked into place with an alarming, almost terrifying, precision. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a thread, taut and undeniable, pulling him back through decades of buried pain. Later that afternoon, the administrative office felt unnervingly quiet, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. Harrison, feigning a need to verify attendance records, found himself subtly navigating the digital labyrinth of student files. His fingers hovered over Chloe's name, a knot tightening in his stomach. He was crossing a line, delving into a student's private life, driven by a ghost from his own. He clicked, pulling up her enrollment file. Chloe's guardian was listed, a single name, a local address, no mention of Vance, no Eleanor. Just a single-parent household. A wave of frustration, sharp and bitter, washed over him. The immediate, obvious connection wasn't there. He'd hoped for a lightning strike, an unmistakable sign. Instead, he found only more questions, fueling a quiet desperation that gnawed at his composure. The ethical quandary of his actions dimmed against the overwhelming need for answers. The last bell of the day rang, its shrill command echoing through the empty hallways. Chloe, surprisingly, was waiting. She approached Harrison's desk, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, a familiar defiance in her stance. He picked up the poetry book, the wildflower still nestled between its pages, and extended it to her. "Chloe," he began, his voice softer than usual. "This book, it seems to hold considerable sentimental value for you." Chloe clutched the book to her chest, her gaze darting to the wildflower. "It was my grandmother's," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She always said it was from her lost love, and that it reminded her of her star child. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. Star child. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, reverberating with an echo from a life he'd been forced to forget. The pieces, once scattered and disparate, were beginning to align with an undeniable, terrifying clarity. Chloe sat in the student chair opposite him, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the classroom. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice imbued with the melancholy of inherited memory. "My grandmother, Eleanor, she was an artist. She had this big, powerful family, but she fell in love with someone they didn't approve of. She always said he was her true love, but they tore them apart. And she lost their child, too." Harrison listened, his own breathing shallow, every word Chloe uttered a fresh wound and a painful confirmation. "This book, and the wildflower," Chloe continued, tracing the cover with her finger, "they were her most cherished things. She said they were all she had left of them. My mom inherited it when Grandma died. She always said it was the one thing that connected us to our real history." Harrison absorbed her words, a profound sense of loss settling over him, intertwined with a fierce, burgeoning hope. Eleanor's artistic spirit, her lost love, their hidden child, it was all there, woven into the fabric of Chloe's story. The last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, painting the classroom in hues of soft gray and twilight blue. Chloe, having shared more than she likely intended, stood to leave. Harrison looked at her, truly looked at her. Not as a student, not as a source of information, but as a fragile, unwitting bridge to his past, a living testament to Eleanor's enduring legacy. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "She sounds like a remarkable woman. To have loved so deeply and lost so much, it's a heavy story to carry." He offered a small, rare smile, a genuine softening of his stern features. Chloe met his gaze, a flicker of surprise, and then a quiet understanding passing between them. She nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, a shared vulnerability hanging unspoken in the air. She left, leaving Harrison with the weight of decades and a newfound, terrifying responsibility. The old art district was a ghost of its former self, a collection of crumbling brick buildings and boarded-up storefronts that whispered tales of forgotten dreams. Mr. Arthur Harrison, usually a man of meticulous routine, found himself standing before one such building, its windows opaque with decades of dust and grime. This, the old city records had confirmed, was where Eleanor Vance had kept her studio. He peered through a broken pane, imagining her here, a vibrant splash of color against the drab reality of his own life. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and neglect. A profound sense of loss, sharp and unexpected, washed over him. He felt the weight of choices made, of a life untaken, of a child he had never known. The studio was empty, but it hummed with her absence, a silent testament to a love that had once burned so brightly. A few blocks away, tucked between a dusty antique shop and a vibrant mural, a small, quirky art gallery defied the district's decay. "Ilara's canvas," a hand-painted sign declared. Harrison stepped inside, the chime of the bell startling him. The air was warm, smelling of turpentine and old paper, a stark contrast to the cold outside. An elderly woman with a shock of silver hair and kind, discerning eyes looked up from a half-finished watercolor. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm. Harrison, feeling a tremor of hope, cleared his throat. "I'm a teacher," he began, "doing some research on local artists from, well, about 30 years ago. I was particularly interested in an artist named Eleanor Vance. Did you, by any chance, know her?" Ilara's eyes softened, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Eleanor," she murmured. "A bright star she was, full of such promise, and such quiet sadness later on. What do you want to know about her?" Ilara offered him a cup of herbal tea, her gaze assessing. "Eleanor came from old money, you know," she confided, stirring her tea. "A powerful family, very strict. They didn't approve of her art, certainly not of her choices." Harrison's grip tightened on his mug. "Choices?" he prompted, his voice carefully neutral. Ilara sighed, a sound heavy with decades of unspoken sympathy. "Oh, yes. She was sent away, you see, for a while. After a scandal, they called it. The family saw to it. Erased her from society, or so they thought." Harrison felt a cold pang of guilt, a familiar ache in his chest. He knew that coded language. He knew exactly what scandal meant. He knew the force that had ripped them apart, the wealth and influence that had crushed their youthful love. He had been powerless then, and the memory stung as fresh as a wound. Ilara's gaze drifted to a small, unframed portrait on the wall, a younger Eleanor, her face alight with an intensity Harrison remembered so well. "She never really recovered from it, you know," Ilara continued, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "The loss, not just of her freedom, but of her secret child. They made her give the baby up." The words hit Harrison with the force of a physical blow. His breath hitched. He had suspected, had desperately hoped it wasn't true, but hearing it confirmed, spoken aloud, shattered the fragile composure he'd worn for decades. His lost child. It was real. Ilara reached across the small table, gently placing a hand on his arm. She carried that grief for years. That little poetry book, the one she always carried, was her only comfort. She said it was a reminder of her one true love, and of the star she sent into the world. Harrison could only stare, his eyes wide and burning, blurring the vibrant artwork around them into a smear of color. The reality of his lost child, his son, filled him with a profound sadness, but also a desperate, impossible hope. The twilight wrapped around his car, a comforting cloak of anonymity. Harrison sat there, engine off, the keys heavy in his hand, unable to move. Ilara's words echoed, a relentless drumbeat in his mind. "Comblite shixro he. Lord, invoke. Invoke. Invoke." He had a son he had never known, a life that had unfolded without him. The weight of his past inaction pressed down on him, a crushing burden. He had been so young, so helpless against Eleanor's powerful family. But he hadn't fought hard enough. He hadn't searched. He had let the pain of loss bury the possibility of a different truth. Regret, a bitter and corrosive emotion, burned in his gut, but beneath it, a new feeling stirred, fierce and unyielding. A resolve. He would find his child. He would not let the past remain buried. He would not lose another moment. The sterile quiet of Mr. Harrison's classroom, usually a sanctuary of order before the morning bell, was shattered by the sharp click of the door. Arthur looked up from organizing his notes, his brow furrowed. Standing on the threshold, a stark contrast to the worn textbooks and scuffed desks, was a man in a suit tailored with surgical precision. He exuded an aura of quiet, unsettling power. "Mr. Arthur Harrison, I presume?" the man asked, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "Julian Vance, a representative of the Vance family. We need to have a word about your recent inquiries." His gaze, as cold and calculating as a winter sea, swept around the room, instantly filling the space with a palpable tension. Arthur felt an unwelcome chill creep up his spine. Julian Vance didn't wait for an invitation, stepping further into the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly on the linoleum. He didn't sit, maintaining his dominant posture. "Let's be direct, Mr. Harrison," Julian stated, his voice a low, controlled murmur. "My family is aware of your recent attempts to delve into Eleanor's past. We find it regrettable. Her relationship with you, 30 years ago, was a youthful indiscretion. Nothing more. A closed chapter." Arthur's jaw tightened. The implied dismissal of his deepest pain was a calculated strike. "I suggest you cease this meddling immediately. There are certain reputations, certain legacies that must be protected. I'm sure a man of your professional standing understands the importance of discretion. Unnecessary complications can arise for those who fail to grasp that concept." The words were polite, almost cordial, yet the threat beneath them was as sharp and undeniable as a surgeon's scalpel. Arthur felt a cold fury begin to simmer, a primal instinct to protect the fragile hope he had just unearthed. Julian Vance departed as abruptly as he arrived, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and a crumpled business card on Arthur's desk. Arthur stared at the card, his hands clenching into fists. The cold, corporate dismissiveness of Julian's words had cut deep, but it also ignited something fierce within him. "Gobbin, gobbin, gobbin, grood. Eid. Gobbin, 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 gobbin. Gobbin, gobbin, gobbin." Eid had been love. A love so profound it had haunted him for decades. Julian's interference, his family's desperate attempt to bury the past, only solidified Arthur's conviction. They were afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of what Eleanor's scandal might reveal. His child was not an indiscretion. His child was a life, a legacy, a piece of Eleanor that still existed. He would not be deterred. Not now. His protective instinct, dormant for so long, roared to life, a silent, unwavering vow to find his lost son. Later that day, the bustling school hallway felt oppressive. Arthur's mind was still reeling from Julian's visit when Chloe approached him, her face pale, her usual defiant spark replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "That man who was here this morning, Julian Vance, he works for the Vance family, right?" Arthur nodded, his gaze softening. "He was talking about my grandmother, Eleanor. My mom," she remembered him, "or someone just like him. They came years ago after my grandma died. Told them to forget, to never speak of Eleanor's mistakes." A profound realization washed over Arthur. Julian's cold tactics weren't new. They were a generational weapon, wielded against Eleanor, and now against Chloe's family. They, too, were victims of this silent, powerful suppression. Back in the quiet of his classroom as the last student left, Arthur looked at Chloe. Her small frame held an unexpected resilience. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Chloe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise you, no one will harm you or your family. Not while I'm here." She looked up, her eyes wide, a flicker of trust replacing the fear. "But what do we do?" she asked, clutching her worn poetry book. Arthur's gaze met hers. "We find the answers, Chloe, together." He didn't elaborate, but the unspoken understanding passed between them, a silent pact forged in shared vulnerability and a burgeoning hope. The poetry book, the symbol of a lost love, now became the emblem of their quiet alliance. The late-night quiet of Mr. Harrison's apartment was broken only by the soft rustle of aged paper. On his sturdy oak table, beneath the focused beam of a desk lamp, lay the worn poetry book. Chloe, her brow furrowed in concentration, sat opposite him, her youth a stark contrast to the lines etched around his eyes. They were collaborators now, united by a fragile thread of hope and a shared, unspoken understanding. Harrison, ever meticulous, had carefully run his fingers over every inch of the binding. every delicate page. "There," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible, her finger tracing a subtle, almost imperceptible seam along the inside of the back cover. It was a faint imperfection, hidden beneath decades of wear, a line that seemed to suggest a deliberate, rather than accidental, irregularity. Harrison's heart gave a sudden, hard thump against his ribs. He took the book, his hand surprisingly steady, and with a precision born of both desperation and a lifetime of handling delicate objects, he applied gentle pressure. There was a soft click, almost unheard, then a small section of the cover gave way, revealing a shallow, dark recess, a hidden compartment. Time seemed to slow, stretching the moment into an eternity. Harrison's breath caught in his throat. Inside the tiny compartment, nestled securely, was a single, folded piece of yellowed paper. It was no bigger than his thumb. He carefully extracted it, his fingers trembling now, the paper feeling impossibly fragile. He unfolded it with exquisite care, revealing a few lines of faded, elegant script. His eyes devoured the words, and a choked gasp escaped him. "For Leo, a star to guide you home, E.V." He read the inscription aloud, his voice rough with emotion, the letters blurring through a sudden film of tears. Below the words, a date was meticulously penned. October 12th, 30 years ago. The exact date of Eleanor's disappearance, the same date that had haunted his dreams for decades. Leo. His son. His Koenigson. The world tilted on its axis, the air rushing from his lungs, replaced by a profound, soul-deep realization. The raw, beautiful agony of a past he'd mourned, now impossibly, miraculously, reappearing. Chloe, her face a canvas of awe and dawning comprehension, stared at the inscription, then at Harrison, her eyes wide. Chloe's gaze, brimming with astonishing clarity, flickered between the faded inscription and Harrison's tear-streaked face. "Leo," she murmured, the name a whisper of recognition. "My mother. She used to hum a lullaby sometimes. She'd mention a lost brother named Leo. She said her grandmother, Eleanor, spoke of him too. A secret she couldn't tell anyone." Her eyes, suddenly luminous, fixed on Harrison. A silent, impossible question hung in the air. Could it be? Could this stern, solitary teacher, who had so unexpectedly stumbled into their lives, be the missing piece, the long-lost connection? Chloe's mind raced, piecing together fragments of her mother's childhood stories, the strange, wistful sadness that had always clung to her grandmother's memories. The wildflower, the book, the lost love, the star child. It all converged into one breathtaking, undeniable truth, a profound and unexpected familial bond. An invisible thread stretching across generations began to form between them in that silent, sacred space. Harrison looked at Chloe, at the mirroring astonishment in her young eyes, and felt a wave of paternal love so fierce it almost buckled his knees. "Leo," he repeated, the name no longer a ghost but a living, breathing promise. He clutched the tiny paper, its edges soft with time, as if it were the most precious artifact in the universe. "My son, all these years, a lifetime of regret, of what-ifs, of unspoken longing, condensed into that single aching realization. I should have fought harder. I should have found her, found him." His voice cracked, but the weakness quickly gave way to a steely, unshakable resolve. "I will find him, Chloe. I swear it. We will find him." Chloe, sensing the immense burden and fierce determination in him, reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was a quiet affirmation, a silent promise of unwavering support. "We will," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Together." As the first faint blush of pre-dawn light kissed the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft gray and rose, Harrison and Chloe remained at the table, the book and the inscription between them. The initial shock had given way to a focused, almost frantic energy. "Adoption records," Harrison stated, his voice now crisp with purpose. "They'll be sealed, but there must be a way." Chloe, already hunched over her laptop, began typing. "Online registries for adoptees and birth families, genealogical databases. We have his name Leo and his birth date. That's more than most have." A sense of shared purpose, of a destiny unfolding, filled the quiet apartment. Harrison felt a surge of hope he hadn't dared to entertain in decades. A grandfather's hope, blossoming in the heart of a man who had long believed his own story was over. The search was no longer just a quest for answers. It was a race against lost time, a profound journey towards a family he never knew existed. The municipal archive was a mausoleum of forgotten lives, a labyrinth of dim aisles, and the pervasive scent of aged paper. Arthur Harrison and Chloe moved through it like silent archaeologists, their mission heavy in the hushed air. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of rustling microfiche and the turning of dusty, ledger-bound pages. Harrison, with his meticulous patience, navigated the bureaucratic maze, speaking in measured tones to indifferent clerks, while Chloe, with the intuitive speed of her generation, coaxed grudging information from archaic computer terminals. They sought a needle in a haystack, a birth record, an adoption certificate, anything that hinted at a child named Leo, born 3 decades ago under the initial EV. Each dead end, each sealed record, was a cold splash of water on the flickering flame of Arthur's hope. He'd trace a name, a date, only for it to lead nowhere, the paper trail dissolving into anonymity. Another blank, he'd murmur, his voice rough with frustration, running a hand through his thinning hair. Chloe, however, remained a beacon of quiet persistence. "It's here somewhere, Mr. Harrison," she'd say, her eyes, though tired, still bright with determination, pointing to another obscure index. Her youthful tech skills, honed on a lifetime of digital searching, complemented his old-school grit, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of lost time. The frustration followed them home, settling in Arthur's apartment like a thick fog. Maps and documents lay scattered across his kitchen table, each highlighted line and circled date a testament to their fruitless efforts. They had hit a wall, a period in history where records were intentionally obscured, a fortress built around secrets. Arthur rubbed his temples, the ache a constant companion. Perhaps a private investigator, he mused, the words tasting like ash. The thought of Julian Vance, that cold corporate shadow, immediately resurfaced. To bring in an outsider felt like waving a red flag, inviting the very interference he sought to avoid. Chloe, however, looked up from her laptop, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about adoptee registries online?" she proposed, her voice soft but firm. "It's not official, not legal records, but people connect. They share their stories. Sometimes they find each other." Arthur looked at her, his stern gaze softening. It was a less conventional approach, a modern whisper where he had expected a legal shout. But Julian's threats had forced them into the shadows, and perhaps, in this digital labyrinth, a different kind of thread could be found. He felt a flicker of renewed hope, a tiny ember in the vast darkness of their search. A week later, the silence of Arthur's apartment was shattered by the shrill ring of his phone. It was late, the city lights blurred outside his window, but the name on the screen, Chloe, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He answered, his voice tight with anticipation. "Mr. Harrison, I think I found him." Chloe's voice was a breathless, excited torrent, a stark contrast to her usual quiet composure. "Through the Adoptee Connection forum? A post from years ago, a man looking for birth family." He listed his adoptive name, Leo Miller, and the birth date, October 12th, 1973. "The exact date, Mr. Harrison?" Arthur felt the world tilt. The information, so long sought, so desperately yearned for, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His hand trembled as he clutched the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. It couldn't be a coincidence. The exact date, the name Leo. "Are you certain?" he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and a burgeoning, impossible joy. He heard the click of her mouse, the rustle of papers, then a bright, clear image filled his screen, a blurry screenshot of an online profile. Leo Miller. Born October 12, 1973. A wave of profound, earth-shattering relief washed over him. He had found his son. He had found Leo. The next morning, the initial euphoria gave way to a more measured, yet still overwhelming sense of relief. With Leo Miller's adoptive name, tracing his family was easier. Chloe, with her digital prowess, quickly unearthed public records and obituaries for his adoptive parents, Margaret and Thomas Miller. They were a middle-class couple, a librarian and a carpenter, who had lived a quiet, respectable life in a suburban town not far from the city. Newspaper clippings spoke of their involvement in local community events, their kindness, their love for their adopted son. Arthur scrolled through old photographs, blurry images of a smiling family, a young Leo with his adoptive parents celebrating birthdays, graduations. A profound sense of peace mingled with his decades-old regret. Eleanor's deepest fear, that their child would suffer, had been unfounded. Leo had been loved, raised in a stable, nurturing home. He saw the contrast with Eleanor's own gilded cage and the life of hardship Chloe and her mother had endured. He had a good life, Arthur murmured, more to himself than to Chloe. It was a bittersweet realization, a lament for what was lost, but a quiet thanksgiving for what had been found. Chloe nodded, her eyes reflecting a similar thoughtful quietness. The injustices of the past remained, but at least, for Leo, there had been kindness. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place that afternoon. Using a combination of public voter registrations, property records, and online directories, Chloe pinpointed Leo Miller's current address. It was a modest suburban home, nestled on a tree-lined street, a world away from the dusty archives and the stern halls of the high school. The address, a simple string of numbers and a street name, now glowed on Arthur's screen, a beacon leading to a future he had never dared to imagine. The reality of it, however, was terrifying. After decades of absence, of simply being a ghost in his own life, he was about to meet his son, the man he had unknowingly fathered, the child he had never held. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he stared at the screen. Chloe, sensing his apprehension, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Ready, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice a quiet anchor. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the weight of a lifetime of longing and regret pressing down on him, but beneath it, a powerful, undeniable surge of hope. "As I'll ever be," he replied, his gaze fixed on the highlighted address, a journey of 50 years about to culminate. Mr. Arthur Harrison gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Each turn of the wheel brought them closer. Each passing suburban house felt like a beat of his own pounding heart. Beside him, Chloe sat quietly, her presence a steady anchor in the swirling anxiety of his mind. The sun, a soft afternoon gold, painted the quiet neighborhood, oblivious to the momentous journey unfolding within the confines of his old sedan. "It feels unreal," he murmured, his voice a dry whisper. Chloe reached over, her small hand briefly covering his tense one. "We're here, Mr. Harrison. You did it." He took a shaky breath, the poetry book and the pressed wildflower resting heavy on the passenger seat, a tangible connection to a past he'd spent decades burying. The car idled at the curb. A neat, unassuming house, painted a gentle cream, stood before them. A swing set in the backyard, a child's bicycle by the porch. A life. His son's life. Harrison felt a wave of nausea, a sudden fear that had nothing to do with Julian Vance, and everything to do with the enormity of this moment. He was about to knock on the door of a man he had never known, a man who was half of his own blood. With a deep, fortifying breath he stepped out, Chloe a reassuring presence at his side. He clutched the poetry book, the wildflower tucked carefully inside its pages. He raised his hand, the knock feeling impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. The door opened. A man, perhaps in his late 40s, stood framed in the doorway. Kind eyes, a gentle smile, a scattering of gray at his temples. Leo Miller. He looked at Harrison, then at Chloe, a flicker of confusion in his gaze. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm, ordinary. Harrison's voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. "Mr. Miller," he began, holding out the book. "My name is Arthur Harrison, and this is Chloe. We believe we have something of yours. Something that connects us to a woman named Eleanor Vance." Leo's smile faltered, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving expression. His eyes, the color of warm amber, widened. Leo, still reeling, led them into a living room filled with comfortable furniture and family photographs. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of decades. Harrison, placing the poetry book gently on a coffee table, began to speak. He recounted his youthful love for Eleanor, the forbidden passion, the wildflower picked from the neglected lot, the forced separation, the heartbreaking revelation of her pregnancy. He opened the book, showing Leo the faded inscription, asterisk, for Leo, a star to guide you home, EV asterisk, and the birth date. Chloe then spoke, her voice steady, explaining her grandmother's side of the story, the whispered memories of a star child. The poetry book, a cherished, enigmatic heirloom. Leo listened, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning recognition. He picked up the book, his fingers tracing the inscription, then looked at Chloe, seeing the undeniable echo of Eleanor in her eyes, in her spirit. Then he looked at Harrison, a man who had been a ghost, now flesh and blood, a father he never knew existed. Tears welled in Leo's eyes, quiet and profound. I always felt like there was a piece missing, he whispered, his voice cracking. A story untold. He extended a hand to Harrison, a gesture of acceptance that spanned 30 years. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, Leo led them into his backyard. It was a tranquil space filled with blooming flowers and the gentle hum of bees. In a small, sun-dappled corner, nestled amongst more common blossoms, was a patch of wildflowers. And there they were, the rare, delicate purple blooms, the very same species Harrison had picked for Eleanor, the very same pressed in the poetry book. My adoptive mother, Leo explained, a soft smile gracing his lips. She loved wildflowers, said they reminded her of resilience, of finding beauty in unexpected places. She cultivated these herself. Harrison knelt, his hand gently touching a bloom, its petals soft against his calloused skin. It was more than a flower. It was a living testament to Eleanor's enduring spirit, a quiet nod from a mother he never knew to a son she was forced to give away. He saw the cyclical nature of love, passed through generations, sometimes lost, sometimes found, but never truly severed. A profound sense of peace settled over him. The ache of a lifetime finally eased. Weeks later, the English classroom at Northwood High felt different. The afternoon sun still slanted through dusty windows, but the light seemed warmer, softer. Mr. Arthur Harrison, though still precise in his teaching, carried a subtle warmth, a quiet ease that had replaced his former sternness. He caught Chloe's eye as she packed her bag, a knowing glance passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible truth they had unearthed, the family they had found. The poetry book, once a source of painful memories, now sat on a small, otherwise empty shelf in his office, a revered artifact. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but of connection. It was the key that had unlocked his heart, reunited him with a son, and brought him a granddaughter he never knew he had. The world, once a place of solitary regret, was now vibrant, alive with the enduring power of family, of second chances, and of a love that, like the wildflower, had bloomed again after decades in the shadows.